Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You'll want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, then I would encourage you to pause the playback right now. Get whatever you need. Once everything's ready, then go ahead and resume the video. So they tell us that we have 5 senses. Can you think of those 5 senses right off the top of your head? So the 5 senses, as far as we know, are vision, are smell, our taste. We also have the sense of hearing, hopefully, and the sense of touch. So those are the 5 senses: vision, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. So I wonder if there was one of those 5 senses that you feel like, if I had to give one up, that's the one I could live without. What would that one sense be? I know that for myself, I feel like the one sense that I could give up would probably be my sense of smell. And here's why. I figure that about half the things out there that we smell on a daily basis smell good, and about half the things that we smell on a daily basis smell bad. So from my perspective, I can give up all of those bad smells and give up my sense of smell. Now, I know that you're saying to yourself right now, yeah, but Pastor Kerry, I know somebody who lost their sense of smell when they had COVID a couple of years ago, and that was a bad deal. And you're right. I'm not saying that it's good to lose our sense of smell. I'm just saying that if I had to give up one, that would probably be it. Now, on the other hand, if there was one of those 5 senses that you absolutely would never ever want to give up, what would that one sense be? Now, when I asked that question over the course of this past week at the Eastmont Chapel services, the one sense that people repeated over and over and over again was their sense of vision. And you know what? I agree with them for the most part. Now, I will say this. I'm not sure if anyone's really thought through the ramifications of losing our sense of touch. Now, there is such a thing. It's actually referred to as touch blindness, which seems kind of strange that it's called touch blindness. Maybe there's another more technical term for it, but that is a very real thing. And if you really think about it, I have a feeling that we would never, ever, ever want to lose our sense of touch. I mean, I just think that that would be a sense that it would be devastating to lose, maybe even more so than our sense of vision. But having said that, yeah, I'm with you. Losing our sense of vision would be devastating. And you have probably already guessed this, but the reason that I bring that up today is because in the Lenten lectionary passage that we're going to be looking at today, it just so happens that Jesus is going to encounter someone who was born without vision, and Jesus is going to heal them. So, the Lenten lectionary passage for March 19th of 2023 is from John chapter 9, and it is a very lengthy passage, and so this has been abbreviated to get it down to a manageable length. So, John chapter 9, verses 1 through 39, starting with verse 1. As Jesus was traveling, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Well, neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. After saying this, Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." So the man went and washed and came home seeing. The man's neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was, others said, "No, he only looks like him." But the man himself insisted, "I am the man." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now on the day which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man Jesus is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. They then in turn said to the blind man, "What have you to say about him? It was he who opened your eyes." The man replied, "He is a prophet. I was blind, but now I see. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth," and they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, Jesus said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped Jesus. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And may God bless the reading of the powerful and profound word. So, this is a passage I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. This is one of the stories from the Gospels that you probably learned about in Sunday school. You probably had a Bible study or two that talked about this. You probably heard a sermon or two about this passage. So, what I would like to do right now is what we always do. I want to take a closer look at the passage, because as much as this seems like a fairly straightforward passage, once we understand, again, the cultural context in which this happened, there's a lot more to this passage. And then, after we dig a little deeper into the passage, I'll want to focus then on three of the misconceptions, three of the mistakes, misunderstandings, whatever you want to call it, and make sure that those misconceptions, misunderstandings that they had thousands of years ago aren't still shared by us thousands of years later. So, the beginning of the passage, it tells us that Jesus and the disciples encounter this man who's been blind from the moment that he was born. He has never ever had vision at any point in his life. And the disciples ask Jesus a question. Well, gosh, I wonder what the disciples are going to ask Jesus. Are they going to ask him, "Jesus, is there anything that you can do to help this poor man?" Are they going to ask him, "Jesus, isn't this sad?" What are they going to ask him? No, the disciples ask Jesus, "Jesus, this guy or his parents, obviously one of them or some of them committed some sort of a sin that caused this man to be blind, that God caused God to punish this man and make him blind. So who was it? Was it his parents or was it the man himself?" As if the man himself could have committed a sin after he was born that would have caused God to go back and retroactively make him blind even before he was born. Just incredible to imagine that that's how they thought 2,000 years ago, but it is. I mean, that is how they thought 2,000 years ago. Now, thankfully, Jesus' response is neither. He says it wasn't the parents, it wasn't the man either. Neither of them sinned. And so then, Jesus does something that's unique in the Gospels. He spits on the ground and reaches down and he stirs up the dirt with the spit, makes mud out of it. And I know you're thinking gross, and I agree, that's gross. And then he scoops it up and he smears it on the eyes of the blind man. And then he says to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is not going to be easy for him to get to. It's a lengthy walk from there, and he's obviously going to have some people take him. Now, why? Why did Jesus, in this particular case, make kind of a show of spitting on the ground and turning it into mud and smearing it on the guy's eyes and making him hike to the pool of Siloam when he could have very easily have said, "You are healed"? And suddenly the blind man would have had his vision restored. Why all of this work to have the man be healed? Well, work is the key word there. And we're going to come back and talk about that here in a few minutes, unless I forget. Hopefully I won't. I do want to come back to that. So then the passage continues and the man goes to the pool of Siloam, he washes off the mud, and sure enough, his vision is restored. And I just want you to think for a moment about what that would have been like. To have been born blind, and suddenly, here you are as a grown man. For the first time, you can see everything. You see your friends' faces. You see their smiles. And to have this whole new universe opened up to you at that moment. How incredible must that have been? What a joyous moment that must have been for this man. Unfortunately, the joy is going to be rather short-lived, because as much as you would like to think that everyone would have celebrated this, well, guess what? The religious leaders were not celebrating this. So why not? Well, first of all, I want to back up for just a minute, and you notice that when the blind man returns home, he is changed. He's like a completely different person. He is so changed that some of his neighbors are saying, yeah, that's not him, and others are saying, no, that is him. No, that can't be the same guy. No, it is. It's the same guy. And he has to speak up for himself and say, it's me. It really is me. And so they take the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. And there's a problem, because the day on which Jesus had performed this miracle was the Sabbath. And you weren't supposed to work. There's that word work again. You weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. Now, the problem is that Jesus, in performing this miracle, he had worked as far as they were concerned. Because if Jesus had just said to the guy, hey, you're healed, would that have been work? Well, it's debatable. But Jesus, in this case, made sure that he had to work in order to perform this miracle. He spits on the ground. He bends down. He stirs it up. He turns it into mud. He spreads it on the guy's eyes. And as far as they were concerned, that was definitely work that Jesus had done. Not only did Jesus have to work to perform this miracle, but the guy, as he goes to walk to the pool of Siloam and then walk back, guess what he's just done just by walking that distance? He has also now performed work, because they were supposed to only walk a maximum number of steps on the Sabbath. If you went over the maximum number of steps that you were allowed to walk on the Sabbath, then you had worked. Well, this man, because Jesus made him walk to the pool of Siloam and back, he has worked on the Sabbath. So Jesus has worked, the man who's been healed has been worked, everybody's working for this miracle. And that's a problem as far as the Pharisees were concerned. And a debate breaks out among the Pharisees. And some of them say, there is no way that this Jesus is from God, because he did this on the Sabbath. And others say, yeah, but how could someone who isn't from God perform a miracle like this? And so the Pharisees are debating with each other. They decide they're going to try to find out what the man who was blind, what he had to say about it. So they bring him in and they say, what do you think? And the guy says, I think that this guy is a prophet, which was a pretty strong statement for him to make. And he says, I was blind, but now I see. Kind of reminds you of the closing line of Amazing Grace, doesn't it? Well, if you ever wondered, now you know where the closing line from Amazing Grace comes from. I was blind, but now I see. And he says, if this man weren't from God, then he couldn't have done this. In other words, this man is definitely from God. And so how do they respond to that? Well, apparently that was not the answer that they were looking for, because they kick him out unceremoniously and insult him on the way out by saying, you were steeped in sin at birth. How rude is that, and how cruel is that? This man has just had the most amazing thing in his entire life happen to him, and because he says, I think that the man who healed me is from God, how could he not be from God? They get mad at him, and they kick him out and insult him. And notice what they say. They basically echo what the disciples had said. They said, you were steeped in sin and birth. So in other words, they're saying either your parents or you sinned, and that's what caused you to be blind in the first place. It just blows your mind that they can't celebrate this with this man. So Jesus hears about this, and so Jesus goes and finds the man that he healed. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, we've talked about this before. Anytime you see that three-word phrase, Son of Man, you're supposed to think to yourself, Son of Man equals Messiah. Son of Man equals Messiah. So Jesus says, do you believe in the Messiah? And the man who had been blind, he says, the Messiah? We've been waiting for the Messiah forever. Who is he? Tell me. And Jesus says, I'm the Messiah. You're talking to the Messiah right now. And I would just point out to you that this conversation is fairly reminiscent of the conversation that Jesus had with the woman at the well just a couple of weeks ago, the Samaritan woman at the well. When she's talking to Jesus and says, well, maybe you're right, maybe I'm right, someday the Messiah will come and he'll tell us everything. And Jesus says, funny you should mention the Messiah because you're talking to the Messiah right now. Now, a very similar thing happens here. And so the man believes and he worships Jesus. And Jesus says something incredibly powerful, incredibly profound, maybe even convicting. At the very end, he says, for judgment, I've come into this world so that the blind will see, and so those who see will become blind. So what I want to do very quickly is I want us to focus on 3 of the mistakes, misconceptions, misunderstandings that they had thousands of years ago and make sure that we don't still share those today. And so here is the first mistake, misunderstanding, or at least say that it's a trap that they fell into 2,000 years ago. The first is the trap of causality. In other words, believing everything that happens is either a reward or punishment from God. Causality. Believing that everything that happens is a reward or punishment from God. When I was a kid, I had a friend whose mother came down with cancer, and it was really serious. And I remember praying to God and saying, God, please make my friend's mom better. And God, if you'll do that, I'll be a better person. I promise. I'll try to be a much better person. And sadly, my friend's mom passed away from the cancer. And I was a little kid, but I remember the guilt that I carried around with me for a long time, and I felt like it's my fault that she died because I promised God that I would try to be better, and I obviously didn't try hard enough. Now, I know that you're thinking to yourself, well, Carrie, you were a kid and you didn't understand. And yet, there is absolutely an understanding that they had 2,000 years ago that is expressed not only by the disciples, but even by the most trained religious people in that day and age. It was shared by the Pharisees. They believed that this man was blind because his parents or he, or both, had done something wrong. And Jesus makes it very clear in verse 3, no, that is absolutely not the case. But we have to understand that 2,000 years ago, that is what they believed. They believed that if your life was going well, that God was rewarding you for being a good person, and that if your life was going badly, it was because God was punishing you for being a bad person. Now, for the most part, we don't believe that today. We understand that that is a misconception. And yet, a lot of us are quick to say when something good happens, oh, God did that for me, or God did that for him, or for her, or whoever, for them. On the other hand, when something bad happens, I think there's a part of us that says, oh, well, God's punishing that person. That person shouldn't have done that, and now God's punishing him. And Jesus makes it very clear, not only here in this very short verse, but over in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, Jesus says that God causes the sun to shine on the good and the evil, and that God sends rain on the just and the unjust. In other words, sometimes good things happen to bad people, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. That's how life works. Stuff happens. Cancer happens. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care, but we can't read into every little thing that happens, God's rewarding me, God's punishing me, because many times life just happens. And we may be more sophisticated than they were 2,000 years ago in their understanding, but I wouldn't say that we have totally arrived. So that is the first trap that we don't want to fall into. And I need to hurry. I'm short on time. The second trap is this. The second trap is legalism, excessively following the letter of the law. legalism, excessively following the letter of the law. Because in this passage, there is something incredible that's happened, and the Pharisees refuse to say, this is great. Why? Because it happened on a Sabbath, and Jesus had clearly worked on the Sabbath. This man had clearly worked to be healed as well. And so they're not going to celebrate it because they were legalistic. And you might recall that that was one of Jesus' biggest criticisms about the Pharisees, is that they were so legalistic. And again, we can look at this and we can say, oh, those Pharisees. I'm so glad that we don't have Pharisees in the year 2023. But do we? Do we have Pharisees in this day and age? I hate to say this, but there have been plenty of times over the course of my 52 years in which I've been a Pharisee. And I'm guessing that if a lot of us are honest, that we would say that many of us have been the modern day Pharisees. Let's not fall into that trap. Let's make sure that we don't get legalistic and follow the letter of the law to an extreme, to the point where we can't love people and be happy for people. All right, got to hurry along. Now, the third and the final trap that we don't want to fall into is the trap of argument. In other words, debating philosophy or theology instead of simply explaining what God has done for us. Argument, debating philosophy or theology instead of simply explaining what God has done for us. Friends, as a pastor, there have been a number of times in my life when people have learned that I was a pastor and said, oh, so you're a pastor. So I have a question for you. And then they ask me a gotcha question. And you know what? That's fine. It's perfectly okay. It comes with the job. It comes with the territory. And I've learned something. I can have a debate over philosophy or theology with anybody. And I can win the debate, I can win the argument. But if I win the debate or win the argument, does that person suddenly say, oh, you're right. You know what? I'm going to become a Christian. I promise you that has never ever happened to me. On the other hand, if I say to them, you know what, you've got some good points. This is what I would counter, but more importantly, let me tell you how God has changed my life for the better. And essentially share with them my testimony and essentially share with them, this is how I, Carrie, was once blind. But God came into my life and now I see. If I can share that with them, then maybe that will help them change their life for the better as well. And friends, we are almost out of time. So let's go ahead and let's get our communion elements and let's move into a time of communion together. Friends, I would just remind you that on the night when Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it and said, this is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then Jesus took the cup and said, this cup is the new covenant. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. Let's pray. God, thank you for changing our lives for the better.